In 1933, roughly 1 American worker in 4 had no job at all. Not reduced hours, no job. And there was no unemployment insurance to speak of, no food assistance as we would recognize it, and for most households, no savings left after 3 years of the thing. So the question that faced an enormous number of American families was not how to earn more. There was no more to earn. The question was how to make what little arrived go further than it had any business going. I have spent years reading what those households wrote down. Ledgers, grocery books, letters, the accounts kept in pencil on the backs of envelopes. And what comes out of them is a body of practice that was completely ordinary at the time and would look, to most people now, close to unbelievable. 12 of them today. The last one on this list was not really a method at all. It was something a great many American storekeepers did quietly and never spoke about, and it kept whole towns alive. Let us begin. A word about the scale of it first, because the numbers do not translate well. $1 in 1933 would buy a good deal more than $1 buys now. But that is not the useful comparison. The useful comparison is that a great many households were not operating in dollars at all. They were operating in cents, weekly, against fixed obligations that did not move. Rent did not fall as fast as wages. Debt did not fall at all. So the pressure landed entirely on the flexible part of the household budget, which was food, clothing, heat, and everything else. What follows is what that pressure produced. None of it was clever exactly. It was simply what people did when there was nothing else to do, and they did it for years on end. Number 12. Buying nothing new. Not less, nothing. Furniture came from a neighbor who was leaving, or from the street, or was already in the house and stayed there another 20 years. Clothing came from relatives, from church boxes, from the second-hand trade, or was made. Tools were borrowed or inherited. There are household ledgers running months at a time with no entry that is not food, fuel, or rent. Not one purchase of anything that could be described as a good. What is striking is how long that could be sustained. A household with a full complement of things already in it can simply stop buying and go on stopping for a very long time, provided nothing breaks. And when things did break, which brings us to the next item. Number 11. Keeping everything on the assumption it would be needed. The string ball, the nail jar, the rag bag, the button tin, the drawer of paper smoothed flat and kept. Every household had these in fixed places, and they were not clutter, they were stock. String came off parcels and went onto the ball. Nails were pulled from anything being taken apart, straightened, and put in the jar. Cloth too worn for anything else became rags, and rags had a dozen uses and could also be sold. Brown paper was folded and kept. So was the string that tied it. There is a well-known joke about a box labeled as containing string too short to be useful, and the joke exists because the practice was universal. The underlying assumption is what interests me. Nothing was going to be easy to replace, so nothing was allowed to leave the house. Number 10. Trading work for what was needed. Cash was the scarce thing, not labor. So a great deal of what changed hands did not involve money at all. A man who could do carpentry did a day's work on a roof and was paid in eggs, or in a share of a slaughtered pig, or with the loan of a horse for a week. Doctors in rural areas were paid in produce constantly, and the practice was so ordinary that it barely required comment. Households traded with each other along the same lines. Somebody had a sewing machine. Somebody else could cut hair. A third had a garden that had done well that year. None of this was recorded in dollars, which means it does not appear in any economic statistic from the period. A very large part of how Americans got through those years is simply invisible in the official record. Number 9. Taking in boarders. The spare room stopped being a spare room. Households with any surplus space at all rented it, usually with meals included, and the boarder became a semi-permanent feature of family life. A single man working a job in town, a widow, a young couple who could not afford their own place. It brought in cash weekly, which was the point, and it cost the household privacy and a great deal of extra work, which fell almost entirely on the woman of the house. Advertisements for rooms fill the classified pages of American newspapers through the whole decade. Reading them now, what stands out is how many are offering a room in a family home rather than in a boarding house. That was not an industry. That was households doing what they had to. Number 8. Doubling up. The step past taking in boarders, and it was extremely common. Grown children moved back. Parents moved in. Siblings and their families arrived. 3 generations in a house built for one family, sometimes 2 families sharing, with the arrangement understood to be temporary and then lasting a decade. The economics were straightforward. 1 rent instead of 2, 1 stove burning instead of 2, 1 garden feeding everybody. The census records of the period show it plainly, and what they do not show is the strain, which by every account was considerable. People wrote about it in letters. Crowded, no privacy, tempers short. And they did it anyway, for years, because the arithmetic was not arguable. Number 7. Making the coffee last. A small thing, but it turns up in nearly every account of the period, which is why it is here. Grounds were used twice, sometimes 3 times. They were stretched with chicory, with roasted grain, with roasted acorns in some rural areas. Some households moved to chicory entirely and stayed there long after the Depression ended, simply out of habit and taste. The same logic applied across the pantry. Sugar rationed by the household before any government thought of rationing it. Butter stretched. Milk watered for cooking. I include it because it shows the granularity of the effort. This was not a household making one big decision. It was a household making 40 small ones a day, every day, for several years, and the coffee was one of them. Number 6. Cooking what nobody else wanted. The cheap cuts and the parts of the animal that had fallen out of fashion came firmly back into the American kitchen because they were what a household could afford. Tough cuts that needed hours of slow cooking, bones for stock, and then the stock stretched into soup, and the soup stretched with whatever was in the garden. Beans in enormous quantity, cornmeal, potatoes in every form anybody could think of. There is a whole body of Depression-era cooking that came out of this, and much of it survived into the 50s and 60s, long after the necessity had passed. The skill involved was real. Making an inexpensive, tough, unpromising ingredient into something a family would sit down to willingly several times a week for years is not a small piece of craft. Number 5. Keeping chickens on a town lot. Not on a farm, in a city. Backyard chickens were entirely normal in American towns, and even in parts of cities through this period. Eggs daily, meat occasionally, and both of them outside the cash economy altogether. Gardens went in wherever there was ground. Front lawns were dug up. Vacant lots were planted, sometimes with permission and sometimes without. Some cities organized it formally and allocated plots. A household with a garden and a few birds had a floor under it that a household without did not. Not comfort exactly, but a level below which things could not fall. That distinction between the households that had that floor and the ones that did not runs through a great deal of what I read from the period. Number 4. Giving up the car and walking. Automobile ownership had grown enormously through the 20s. Then a great many of those cars were sold or laid up on blocks because the owner could not afford to run one, or simply abandoned. So people walked. Considerable distances, routinely, in all weather, and thought nothing of it. Children walked to school, adults walked to work, and a trip that would now be a 15-minute drive was an hour each way on foot. Where there was a streetcar, people used it and counted the fare carefully. What strikes me about this one is how quickly it reversed afterward. Within 20 years of the Depression ending, walking that kind of distance had become something Americans simply did not do. The capacity did not go away. The habit did. Number 3. Cutting hair and making clothes at home. Every service that could possibly be performed inside the house came inside the house. Haircuts at the kitchen table, done by whoever in the family had the steadiest hand, with results that were sometimes better than one might expect, and frequently worse. Clothes cut and sewn at home from patterns, or from feed sacks, or from other clothes. Shoes were repaired at home where possible, with kits sold for the purpose, and taken to a cobbler only when the job was past domestic skill. The pattern here is the same one running through this entire list. Anything that had been a transaction became a task. The money did not exist, so the labor was substituted, and the labor was almost always somebody's evening. Number 2. Going where the work was. Men left, in very large numbers, and often without a clear destination. They went to where a rumor said there was work, and a great many rode freight trains to do it, which was dangerous and illegal and enormously common. Hundreds of thousands of people were moving around the country this way, including a startling number of teenagers. Money was sent home when there was money. Letters came when there was something to say. Some men were away for months, some for years, and some did not come back at all, which is a plain sentence covering a great deal of grief. Households restructured themselves around the absence. The wife ran everything. The eldest child took on adult work, and that arrangement, meant to last a season, frequently became the shape of a family for the rest of the decade. Number 1. The Grocer's Book. And here's the one I mentioned at the start. Nearly every small American grocer kept a book, and in that book were the accounts of the families in the neighborhood who could not pay that week, or that month, or that year. He carried them. He kept selling them food and writing the amounts down, knowing perfectly well that a good portion of it would never come back to him. There was no institution behind this, no program, and nothing obliging him to do it beyond the fact that he knew these people, and they had nowhere else to go. A great many of those grocers went under doing it. Some of them, when things recovered, quietly closed the books without collecting. There are accounts of storekeepers burning the ledgers in front of the families concerned. It appears in the historical record almost by accident, because it was not the sort of thing anybody wrote down at the time. It was simply what a person did. 12 then, and not one of them a strategy anybody chose. I am not going to tell you it was better. It was 3 or 4 years of grinding, exhausting, frightening improvisation, and the people who lived through it spent the rest of their lives being strange about food and money in ways their children noticed. But it is worth seeing the shape of it. Almost everything on this list is a household or a neighborhood absorbing a shock that was far too large for it, using nothing but labor, thrift, and each other. That is what keeps turning up in the ledgers. Not nostalgia, just an enormous amount of very small arithmetic, done by hand, in pencil, by people who had run out of every other option. I am Harlan Fenwick. The Almanac continues.